Hello, everybody. Sorry, I don't have a fancy comic for you. I've been having fun drawing those and making them. They're actually so much easier than you think they're going to be. This template just writes itself. It's beautiful. Tonight we're talking about Nelson Goodman and Nelson Goodman's kind of subjectivist philosophy. So this morning we were talking about truth again and talking about realism and relativism and whether truth is stance dependent or not, whether truth is subjective or is there possibility of objective universal knowledge? That was another thing that we were kicking around. um, and we're going to be continuing those discussions with Nelson Goodman. Goodman is I really like talking about Goodman. He is one of my more favorite philosophers. I haven't picked the curriculum in this class, just picking out all my favorites and showing you everything that I agree with. I definitely give you guys some philosophers I don't agree with, but I'm happy to put my cards on the table. Nelson Goodman is I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Nelson Goodman. I think he does a good job kind of cutting through a lot of confusion and like just laying things out there in an easy way to understand, especially for a position like subjectivism, which is notoriously difficult to pin down and to describe. So even though I think Goodman is definitely one of the more accessible subjectivists, or you might say pragmatists, that's out there too. It's still a difficult position, and there's some wacky things about it that we're gonna have to talk about. So, he also here's another good thing to know about Nelson Goodman before I really get rolling with him. He's not. I mean, he's well known. He's a well known philosopher, but he's a 20th century, mid 20th century contemporary. That counts as contemporary for philosophy when we're counting by the hundreds of years. He's definitely a contemporary, but he's not like he's not how you say a big deal. He's no Immanuel Kant. He's not even a like David Lewis, who's a big contemporary philosopher, pretty big deal. But he's still well known, and but I don't think he always gets the attention that he deserves. I think he actually made some pretty big philosophical contributions, and he is mostly overlooked. He's definitely his kind of philosophy is not what's in vogue anymore these days. Not to say that these views are not around there, because they definitely are, but you just don't hear people talking about them quite as often as some of the other positions. I'd say realism is probably the position that has the most adherence in professional philosophy circles today, but kind of depends on who you're talking to, too. All right, the game plan with Goodman, we're going to talk about a few different things. There's going to be kind of like 3 movements to my lecture, and we're probably not going to get through all of it tonight. But the first one is going to be just understanding what the hell Goodman is talking about when he's talking about worlds, and especially worlds versus the world. So like we'll talk about lowercase worlds and uppercase capital W world sort of thing. What are we talking about there? What is the subject matter that we're getting into? And some kind of broad scale, big general scale stuff about this particular topic, which is called ontology, it's a kind of metaphysics, and that's what I'll be talking about in a second. So just wait. That's the first movement of my lecture. Will just be kind of setting the stage and describing what we're up to here, what Goodman is trying to do, his general game plan, and what he means when he talks about worlds. The second thing we'll talk about are the titular component to Goodman's theory, ways of world making. So he's going to talk about the different tools that we have in our at our disposal with which to construct worlds. So I'll be going through a bunch of different things that he picks out as being things that we can work with and how they work. And then the third phase of my lecture, and arguably the most important, will be Goodman. I'll be lecturing on Goodman's understanding of what are the proper standards with which to make worlds. So we got to talk about what worlds are, how we make them, and what are the standards for evaluation of a good world versus a bad world. And truth is going to get in here along the way. So those are the 3 movements, and let's start by talking about what we're talking about when we're talking about a world for Goodman. Let me remind you of a familiar situation here. I've drawn this picture for you a few times now, although I'm going to update it a little bit. Might as well, since I got this wonderful board here. I'll even give him really massive eyeballs. All right, so here's T-Rex. Seeing a tree, thinking of a tree. And we were talking about how this is his like perception. This is what's going on inside his subjective perception. And then presumably there's some kind of like actual tree out here. But remember when we were talking about with Descartes and, you know, over the past couple of weeks here, that there's this kind of barrier about how do I know that what's going on in my perception really lines up with how reality actually is. So this is the world of the subjective, right here. And then over here, this is what we're going to talk about as the capital W world. This was the world that Hume was talking about when he was talking about how synthetic claims are made true by the world. It's the world that makes them true. The world has to be in a certain state. And so when we were talking with Descartes, that if my belief is true on the standard model, what we take that to mean is that it corresponds with how reality actually is. And if it doesn't correspond in that way, then it's not really true. And Descartes also was the one who brought to our attention how we do not see this correspondence relation. We do not have the access to be able to confirm that what's going on in experience does match up with reality. All those skeptical thought experiments, the evil demon stuff, the dreams, or you might think of like matrix cases, sorts of things, those things, even though we don't have any reason to believe that evil demons exist or that we're in the matrix or anything like that, there's nothing suggesting that that's what's going on. Still, the fact that we can't discount the possibility tells us something about our epistemic position. Basically, that we can't tell whether the thing that's causing our experience, whatever is causing us to have this experience, actually has the properties that the experience represents it as having. That's the key point here. Goodman is starting from this standpoint too. This is sort of like the backdrop for what he wants to say. So I'm going to come back to this model with him in a second. But when Goodman wants to talk about worlds, he wants to talk about these things. These are worlds. They're what we take the world to be like. They're like sets of beliefs about what is going on in the world. They might be theoretical, though they're almost always theoretical. They're going to have some sort of stake about what exists and how it exists. And this is called an ontology. And the study of ontology is basically the debate about what to put in our picture of the world and the universe and everything. What stuff exists? How does it exist? How are they related to each other? That whole thing, all that work is ontology. I've been describing these sorts of questions as metaphysical, and that's right. Questions about ontology are metaphysical questions, but metaphysics also gets into some stuff that's like not directly ontology. In a lot of cases, in most circumstances, they can be kind of treated a little interchangeably, but there's some fine-grained stuff where they're different. But anyway, basically, if we're going to have a debate about ontology, it's like, how should we populate our conception of what exists in reality? That we're all kind of, regardless of what's going on over here, and whether it's really true or false, whether we're in the matrix or not, that doesn't matter. We're not talking about this right now. We're talking about this and just how we've got some sort of picture of the world. When Goodman talks about worlds, he means ways of representing. That's probably the best definition. Or ways of describing is a really, I also like that phrase too. Descriptive systems, versions of reality. They're ways that they're pictures. They're like mental pictures. They're representational states in our mind that depict the world as being a certain way. And those pictures are an ontology. What's in those pictures is our ontology. So T-Rex here, when he thinks about like what exists in the world, maybe he includes things like houses he can smash, and people, and Utah Raptor, his buddy. Like, he's populating his conception of the world with various things. And it's not like you're always thinking about this world that you've got up in your head, but you are constantly updating it. As new experiences roll in, you start like being like, oh yeah, there's that and this, and you're tracking all these facts, all these things, all these beliefs you have about what is true and what's going on in reality. And it's not just like a big collection of data, like not just facts, but it's also about the systems that generate those beliefs and how all those little pieces of information are getting organized, how they're being interpreted. All of that stuff is a part of ontology. Worldview is not a bad word here for what Goodman means by worlds. Okay, so this is the subject of ontology. How are you guys doing so far in the chat here? Is this making sense? Yep, cool. All right. Here's a classic ontological question. Does your ontology include God or not? Is there an object of God in your ontology or not? That would definitely be an ontological question. When we were talking with personal identity and souls, like, do you believe that mental substances exist? Are those sorts of things things that your version of the world puts a place for? Is that a part of it or not? Those are ontological questions. Here's some things. There's probably a couple of things I should say about worlds here before I leave this behind. When Goodman's talking about worlds and different ways, different world versions, he's not talking about things like alternate realities. He's not talking about counterfactual possible worlds like we were discussing when we were doing that epistemology with Plato's Theaetetus last week. It's not like other ways things could be. It's other ways of describing what is, in fact, true. They're like different ways to carve it up, different ways to carve up reality. And we can have different ideas about what's really going on and what's not, like whether there's God or not, or whether there are souls or not, or whether there is strings, like string theorists, subatomic particles that make up everything supposedly. Do you have an ontology that includes strings or not? Not all physicists like that. They don't all like string theory. Some of them think that it's not the best way to explain what's going on in physics. So these are ontological questions. That's what worlds are about. It's not fantasy worlds. It's not alternate realities. That's not what we're talking about. It's just like different ways of looking at things, different worldviews, different stances. Okay, so worlds are by definition subjective. They're about what we're doing, not about what's happening with the world. But isn't this what we really are interested in? Like, don't we want our worlds to match up with the world? Isn't that the whole point of constructing these things? These like theoretical models of what we think is happening in reality? And that is the whole point of it. But Goodman is someone who has taken the skeptical threats that Descartes has brought up very seriously. Not in the sense that he thinks we should really throw out all those beliefs, but it tells us something about the grounds on which we can hold those beliefs. Basically, what Descartes thinks, what Goodman thinks Descartes, and then mostly Kant later on. Kant's kind of a big deal in this whole movement, and I've always thought about teaching Kant to you guys, but Kant is very, very difficult to explain in a very succinct way. So I don't do it. But if you want to ask me about Kant sometime, I will happily oblige you on that. He's one of my favorite philosophers. He's also totally wacky and nuts, and I love the crazies. Sometimes they have some really good ideas. But anyway, the point here, actually, I'm going to use a Kantian term here. Things in themselves. I kind of ran out of space there, but the world that we're talking about over here, the world that exists apart from all human subjectivity or perception or thought or reason or whatever, feeling, whatever you like, all the stuff that's subjective. The world apart from that stuff is what Kant calls things in themselves. Things as they exist apart from us knowing them or perceiving them or doing anything subjective with them. And this is what makes the world what it is. It's the world that exists when there's no perceivers around at all. Like you get all the humans out, everyone who can like have thoughts or beliefs about the world, there still is a world that's left. And whatever that thing is like, that's what we're talking about here. But if Descartes is right, which I think he is, and I haven't seen anyone argue otherwise really through the entire history of philosophy, that we don't have access to this correspondence relation, that we cannot tell that what's happening with our perceptions, the causes of our perceptions, actually match what those perceptions look like, then this whole world, Goodman says, is useless to us. It is basically functionally, this is the key point, functionally inert. If we don't have access to it, then how can we use it to have standards about what we should believe? If it's nothing that we can have contact with, if it's nothing that I can perceive or experience or have contact with directly, then this isn't so useful as a standard about what we should believe. That basically we've been cut off from this, so all we're left with is this, the world of the subjective. And Goodman is going to argue that if we're going to have standards here for what kinds of ontologies we should build, what sorts of worlds we should be constructing, in other words, what sets of beliefs we should be endorsing as true, are going to depend about standards that we can have access to on the subjective side of things. And this is a really key thing that defines Goodman as the type of philosopher that he is, which is namely a subjectivist. Let me say a little bit more here about this world of things in themselves and how they're not useful, and to maybe help get your intuitions going for this. I'm going to use a little thought experiment that Kant uses. Kant talks about take some thought. So I got this pen. I always use this pen or the cup. Those are the two objects that are in my hand, I guess, that for these things. What? Do I have anything more interesting here? Whatever. Pen's fine. Okay, so I got this pen, and I'm thinking about the pen, this object of the pen, and I'm having all these sensations of it. Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, yeah, it smells nice. I got all these sensations of it, but that is not what the thing in itself, the thing on this side, is all those perceptions. So I got to take my thought of this pen and drain away everything that's subjective, and we're going to see what's left. So I drain away all the sense content from it. That includes the touching that's happening, the sight that's happening, the smells, the whole gamut. Everything is gone. And then even there, we're not done yet, because this is even when I talk about the pen, I've already selected it as an object for thought against all the other stuff that's going on. So even the concept of objecthood is something that I'm doing. Reason is imposing this onto experience in order for me to have the thought of the pen, as opposed to this like just weird sensory overload mess sort of thing. I have to carve it up mentally. I have to specify this object versus other things, right? Like that this is different from my hand. Conceptually, I've carved that up. But even the concepts are subjective. That's something that's subjective to a being like me. Reality as it exists on its own is not carved up in those sorts of ways. Not with concepts. It's not a thinking thing that so maybe, right? We'll talk about that some other time. Maybe reality is not, if it's just material substances, it doesn't have any thoughts about itself or something like that. So when we start trying to think about the thing in itself, and we drain away everything that's subjective, there's really nothing left. Everything that I encounter in reality is mediated through my subjectivity. This is what subjectivists believe. Now, not all philosophers endorse this. Some philosophers think that uh, our subjectivity is transparent, is how they usually put it. And what that means is that I get to see reality directly through my perceptions, that things really are how they look to me to be, instead of thinking of my experience as like a sensory input that has its own determinate content, but that's not necessarily reflecting the properties of the causes of those experiences. Let me say that again, because that might have been a little confusing. Let's take what's a good way to explain this? I want to use kind of a metaphor for you. Let's take some kind of elaborate system where I'm trapped inside of a box that's on a flatbed that's being driven around town, and I can't see what's going on outside. I don't get to see that directly, but I have a friend who's drawing pictures of everything that he sees, and then like popping them through a slit, and then I get to look at them and be like, oh, there's a lake over there, and oh, there's a McDonald's or whatever, right? Okay, so the pictures that I'm getting in the box are not the realities themselves. Like the picture, when I draw a picture here, I just talked about McDonald's. I'll draw it. Here's there's a really bad picture of a McDonald's right there. See the M? It's like the golden arches. McDonald's didn't pay me anything to make this video lecture. So this is a picture that represents a McDonald's really badly. This picture is not an actual McDonald's. No one would say that that's true. It's just depicting it. And it's got its own properties, like the shape of the lines and everything like that, even though it's representing some other object that exists in reality. So there's a difference here. That's the same sort of thing that a subjectivist like Goodman thinks about experience. That experience has its own properties to it. It's a mental property. It's like a consciousness thing. There's the particular smell of the Expo pen. That is something that is really about me and my subjectivity, not about this pen. Even if there is a real pen and it's causing me to have the certain types of sensations that I do, however it is set up doesn't have the same properties as the thing that I'm encountering in subjective experience. So that means these things are not equatable, or if they are, I'm in no position to be able to tell. Okay? Maybe it takes God or something like that, like Descartes was saying, to hook them up right. But I can't tell. So if this is functionally inert to me, I can't use it as a standard. We're stuck inside the subjective hole. And what are we supposed to do? All right. So that's a little bit more of the set. That's kind of foreshadowing where Goodman's going to go next with this. Remember I told you there's 3 segments to my lecture. There's explaining what we're talking about with worlds with Goodman, which I actually have a few more things to describe on that level. Then we'll talk about how we construct these things. So now that we've got a basic idea about what worlds are, the second section is going to be about how we construct these worlds, which Goodman thinks are always constructed out of previous worlds. Every making of a world is a remaking. It's always taking something that we already got and messing around with it. So how we construct these things, and then the third one, and like I said, arguably the most important one, is about how we evaluate whether these worlds are good worlds or bad worlds. Did we do a good job making a world or not? And you might be thinking that once we lost contact with the actual world, once we said there's nothing we can do with this, you might be thinking that the only other option is relativism. There goes truth. Boom. No objective universal truth anymore now that we lost this thing. But Goodman is not going to argue that. Goodman, this is what it means to be a subjectivist. I was talking about this distinction this morning in class, that you've got relativism, you've got realism, and then you've got in the middle, everyone's unhappy with them, the subjectivists. Subjectivist, yes, I can spell. Okay, so the realist believes that there is a stance-independent reality, like this thing, that makes things true. And so there's objective universal truth, because truth depends on that world being a certain way. Relativism thinks that truth doesn't work that way, that truth is stance-dependent, that it's about things that are subjective in this side of things. And because they are stance-dependent, the relativist believes that's going to make it so that there's no universal objective truth. But the subjectivist says, not so fast on that inference, relativist. I'm going to believe that truth is stance dependent and they're called, basically that means that truth is subjective, but at the same time there is universal objective truth. So just because the subjectivist is saying, just because we're playing around in this world of subjectivity doesn't mean that there aren't any standards. There are standards. There are universal objective standards, and we'll talk about that as providing standards for truth. You'll notice in the Goodman reading that he doesn't abandon notion of truth just because he gave up on capital W world and said we had no access to this and we couldn't use it in our reasoning. That doesn't mean he doesn't think that there isn't something that we call truth. And the subjectivist wants to say there are some standards for this, and there are also objective standards for what we call correctness, and that's one of the cool things that Goodman talks about. He says whether or not a worldview or a world version is a good one doesn't just depend on truth, but on a lot of other very interesting factors as well. So we'll be talking about that more again when we get to the third phase of my lecture, which will probably not happen tonight. But this, I kind of wanted to give you guys a good glimpse of the whole package here, even though it's going to take some time to get through it. Okay. Oh, Daniel is asking, when we say good world, are we talking about moral or true? Maybe my last answer kind of just what I was just talking about helps answer that question, Daniel. Because when we're talking about moral truths in philosophy, it might be meaning something like very, very specific, but at the most general level, moral just means normative. It's just about what is good and bad and right and wrong. Normativity is about value as opposed to just what exists. This is the descriptive normative distinction, which I think I've talked to you guys about before, maybe really early in the quarter. We were talking about the distinction between descriptive truths and normative truths. And the interesting thing that Goodman is saying is that if we're talking about a good normative world, usually under the standard model, the only standard here for correctness is the correspondence relation, the correspondence between what I believe and how the world is. But now that we got rid of this because we have no access to it according to Goodman, there can still be some standards for truth. But Goodman also points out that truth is not the only thing that we care about for a good world or a good worldview, that there are other values that are at stake too, and those could be, I think, fairly characterized as ethical. This is the pragmatism that Goodman is exhibiting. If you guys remember pragmatism from Parfit, talking about personal identity. Remember, Parfit was saying, he's like, I don't really think it's true that there's this thing, personal identity. But you know what? Let's come up with this pragmatic concept of identity, because we still need something like that to make things work in the world. Like, I need to track attendance and to be able to do grades. That's something important that matters, supposedly, about the education system. So I gotta be sort of using this pragmatic concept of identity, even if I don't really believe that it's actually true. And that's what Goodman is going to be talking about when he says that there are these projects or purposes that we have worlds for. And a good world needs to meet those criteria. It needs to be able to do what we want a world to do. Even if the only goals that we're talking about there are theoretical. Like, scientists develop theories for certain purposes. And I'm not just talking about like building bridges and cell phones or weapons of mass destruction or something like that. It's that I have theoretical ambitions as a scientist. I want an explanation for something. If this theory can't give me an explanation, it's of no use to me. That is part of the, and here's a fancy word for all your dinner parties, the desiderata of a theory. The standards that we hold a theory to, the kind of criteria for a good theory we refer to sometimes when we're feeling fancy as a desiderata. And one of the things that we care about for theories is that they're capable of making predictions, accurate predictions, and they are capable of giving good explanations. And there's a whole criteria for what's a good explanation too. But even something like that, like being able to, like, say something weird happened and I want an explanation for it. Even something that's like intellectual or like thought based or theoretical is still a pragmatic purpose in the philosophical position of pragmatism. I think I'm going to stop talking about it right now because it's going to come back later once we do this big third section of the Goodman lecture, which is probably going to happen on Monday. But I want to check in with everybody. So far, so good. We're kind of at the halfway mark here. So, how you guys doing? Cool? Just why he uses the word. Lawrence is wondering why he classifies these things as worlds. Why Goodman does. Is it just the use of the word worlds? Okay, so maybe he could use a word like perceptions or something equivalent, but a perception is much too specific. A perception is like a sensory experience kind of thing. And a world is more like a set of beliefs. And it's not even just a belief, it's a very complex system of beliefs that are all like working in hopefully systematic ways. Not always. We don't all have very coherent thoughts and beliefs. Not always. But that's the goal. It can get fairly complicated and complex. So calling it something that's not a perception or a belief or something like that makes some sense, I think. Also, in some ways, I'll put it this way: Goodman, like Kant, does not deny that this world exists. He just denies that we could know anything about it, that we have any like direct contact with it, that we know what states are present here, which makes it, like I said earlier, functionally inert as something that we can use as a part of reasoning about what we should believe. So even though we've got these like subjective things about us, we are kind of projecting a picture of what we think is going on outside of us. And in that sense, to talk about them like worlds makes sense. It's a way, like Goodman's favorite phrases for this are ways of describing the world or ways of depicting the world. His main point is that we don't get the world directly. Not We don't get the world without it being processed and filtered and run through all the subjective stuff that's going on with us. But that doesn't mean that it's like so disconnected that maybe there isn't some kind of connection here. If that might sound a little like I'm contradicting the description I gave of Goodman earlier, it really isn't. But this is just about trying to like use words, and sometimes I got to use them in more technical ways. The key thing here is that Goodman doesn't deny such a capital W world, but just says that encountering this thing directly in a way that's unconceptualized or unperceived or unthought about is just impossible. So we might not be able to distinguish this. The subjective has got its grubby mitts on everything. Okay, there is no pure world of things in themselves that we encounter, so we can't use it. But these things are still trying to like aim at this. So in that sense, it might make sense to use the word worlds for them. He does not mean different dimensions. He does not mean different dimensions. Different dimensions would be like alternate realities or something like that, like parts of reality that are not what's right in front of me. But Goodman wants to talk about what's right in front of me. Um, Here's a good example of worlds. Actually, I just thought about this. Imagine I had a little bit more water in this glass. We talk about like, is the cup half full or half empty? That's a way of looking. It's a way of describing what's going on. That you could look at it one way or the other. Maybe the same world, like the same reality is right in front of me, but how am I thinking about it is important. And how I carve up reality, that's a world. That's a world version or whatever Goodman is talking about as worlds. Um, here, this might also help. So this is some of the other things I need to describe before we move on to the second phase of the lecture. Goodman makes a big point early on, or he makes a big deal out of how there are many worlds. And when he says that there are many worlds, we got to understand what he means by this. We know that by worlds he means some way of describing or way of depicting reality. He doesn't mean alternate states of affairs or alternate dimensions or counterfactual possibilities or possible worlds, parallel universes, nothing like that. Nothing like that. They're just different ways of carving up reality to make sense of it. So when he says that there are multiple worlds, he's saying a couple interesting things. One, he's saying that there are multiple systems of depiction, which is pretty trivial. I mean, that's not something very exciting to say. Of course, different people look at things in different ways. You know, like the glass is half full or half empty. Now that we've got relativity, we could say it's equally true that the sun moves around the earth and the earth moves around the sun. Just depends on your frame of reference, right? So there are different ways of depicting the same realities. And that's not very interesting. That's pretty ordinary and obvious. We all would agree that that's true. It's pretty much unattackable. It's not very controversial. But the second claim that Goodman's making is where things get interesting. So he wants to say not only are there multiple ways of depicting the world, but there are multiple ways of depicting the world that we ought to endorse. And that we can't, and this is another way of describing that same point, we can't reduce all of those world versions to just one world version. Let me give you an example of what a reduction would look like. Actually, let's use relativistic physics. So, it's Einstein that teaches us that things like motion are really relative to a frame of reference. So, here's the sun and the earth, and from the frame of reference of the sun, the earth is like traveling around it. But if we fix the earth as the center, which is what we're usually doing when we're kind of thinking about just then, we see, the sun rise and fall, and it seems like it's moving around the earth, right? Sun moving around the earth. Sorry, man, it gets sloppy when I try to draw it this way. Okay, so both of those things are true. And relativity gives us a way of kind of translating between frames of reference as well, so that we can see how these two things are really equivalent to each other. So any kind of system which allows me to depict multiple world versions, or to translate between multiple world versions into a single world version, that is a reduction. So let's start actually thinking about the worlds that Goodman thinks that we have. There's ones of like, I'm going to call them qualia. This is just a fancy philosophical term that means what it is like of subjective experience. The like taste of peppermint ice cream. I keep using that one as my example. It's just so evocative. Or the smell of this expo marker. I'm going to keep sniffing all night. Qualia is like a bunch of concepts that I use for categorizing the subjective sense perceptions that I have. And then I've got some other things here. Like I got this model of let's put it this way. Yeah, let's just start with this. I've got I got some scientific worldviews here. Science tells me certain ways about how the world is, and actually, science is not one big unified paradigm. Actually, this is one of the problems for science. Is that what we really have is we've got a bunch of small ones, like we've got physics, and we've got chemistry, and we've got biology, and all these different fields. And it'd be really nice to be able to have what scientists refer to as a gut, a grand unified theory, some scientific theory that relates all these truths to each other. So like the gut would be big enough that it would be able to let me make translations about all these truths from one to the other. We don't actually have that yet. We don't have a way of relating what's going on at all these different levels in which we're exploring reality. We're working on it. I mean, that's something we're working on, but we're not quite there yet. So even science is is fragmented. It doesn't have a reduction here. And then I might have some other things, like maybe I've got some, especially for Goodman really cares about this one because he's got a whole lot of philosophy referring to this subject, and that maybe I've got some artistic worldviews. Like Goodman talks about a worldview of like Gauguin's way of looking at the world. Like that's got its certain, or Picasso, he's got like a way of looking at reality that is shown through his paintings. And that is a world version, according to Goodman. Goodman thinks it's a way of depicting reality, and it has its own kind of like meaning and properties and stuff like that. Whether it's a good world version or not, I mean, that's something that we'll be able to debate later. But it is another world version. So I've got maybe some artistic modes that I use to encounter the world and make sense of it. Maybe I've got some religious ones or spiritual paradigms that I'm using too to make sense of reality. I mean, I've got all these different perspectives that are. I've got a big one. Oh, we can't forget this. I've got cultural paradigms. Maybe I've got some really obnoxious ones, in my opinion, like some gender paradigms that I'm looking at. Basically, what I look like is a big mess of all of these different worldviews that are all going at the same time. And that can be really confusing and frustrating, especially for philosophers who like to have everything organized and to sort out what's going on in reality. And so we might be tempted from time to time to try to reduce these in some sort of way, to have like a gut, like something that is a foundation from which I can make translations and relate what's going on in all these different systems, so that I don't have like a ton of different worldviews that are invented just to deal with every ad hoc situation that happens. I've got one theory. I can like run one theory that's comprehensive and powerful enough that it can address all these different facets. A reduction, when it can happen, is very useful. It's very powerful. And when we're talking about being reductive, we're not talking about something like close-minded dogmatism or fundamentalism or something like this. I mean, those are attempts at being, those are reductive accounts. Okay, that's what reductionism can look like, is reducing everything to like a single paradigm. And if that paradigm is very, very tiny, then it's not going to work. We're definitely doing some violence to reality at the same time that we're not going to fit the kinds of standards that Goodman's going to talk about in the third section of my lecture. Pardon me. But not all reductions have to look like that. Sometimes a paradigm, like I said, is comprehensive enough, it's detailed enough, it's got a little spot for everything, so everything got covered. We didn't leave some big things out when we made the reduction. If we can do that, that would be really awesome. It'll allow me to like relate things to each other, which is always better than having them separated in the sense. Well, let me be careful about how I say that. Like take this for example. When we're trying to understand different like cultural paradigms, it can be very difficult for us to understand cultural paradigms that are different from ours. And at the beginning, here, let me erase this and start drawing another picture. So I've got some cultural worldview. I'm going to call it my culture. And in some ways, this is going to look different for every individual person. Like what I think of as my culture is going to be different from yours, even though we're all Americans, or even if we share certain demographic similarities. Like if you're a white male Protestant like me, then we're still going to have differences here. So I got my culture. And the thing about worldviews, and this is a good time to talk about this. I wanted to bring this in sooner or later. Worldviews are, like I said earlier, they have pragmatic value. They do things for us. They're not just like intellectual curiosities. They are the way that we make decisions. They're basic. They always perform two functions for us. They make sense of our experience. They help us relate experiences to each other in a way that is sensible. And they help us decide how we should act, what we should do, how we should live. Those two basic questions that I described about philosophy, that it's like interested in what should we think and how we should act, a worldview is accomplishing both of those functions for you practically. That's exactly what it exists for, is to do those sorts of things. So I got my culture that's sitting around. This is my worldview. Maybe I've got some other, I definitely have some other worldviews here, but this is me. Uh, and this is what I use to make sense of reality and to make decisions about how to live. And then you've got your culture over here. That's different from mine. And if it comes into my, life because I see you or I have to live with you or we talk or have any kind of interaction at all, I'm going to have an encounter with your culture. And at the beginning here, it's really hard to try to just assimilate it right into here. I'm going to be definitely doing some violence to my understanding of what's going on with you if I'm constantly having to relate it to everything that's going on with me. So this is going to be a slow process. I'm going to have to kind of treat this as something separate before I really like understand it. I have to like really listen. Okay? I might even have to like spend some time like in your culture, like living in it, like bathing in it, like subsuming myself in it before I'm really going to get it or even come close to getting it. Maybe getting it is even impossible. For anyone to understand anyone else's culture might be ultimately impossible, but we can make some progress or less progress. Okay? And at the beginning, I might need to be very careful to not try to relate this too much to what's going on with me and where I'm coming from, at the risk of me not understanding what this really is and doing an unfair reduction to it. But you could imagine someone sitting around with both of these sort of, so now I've got some contact, I've got some understanding at least of some other foreign cultures to me, and I could have them still compartmentalized inside my head where they're not being related. There's no connections here with, the culture that I started with. I haven't formed any connections with them. This situation would not be as good as a case in which I had some framework to work off of that allows me to have this dialogue, to have this discussion, for me to relate what's going on with the worldview that I previously had with the worldview of other people. This is what we might hope for. I mean, this is what I think we kind of have to hope for if we hope for growth and understanding and dialogue between human beings. We basically, if that's going to happen at all, we need some platform or some paradigm, a kind of world that facilitates that exchange of information that allows us to relate different things to each other and to see what's different and what's the same. And this is, I was talking to another student earlier this week about this. This is another cool idea from Kant that I think is always useful here when we're talking about how paradigms unify experience for us and how that's a good thing, that's like kind of what their function is for. Kant says, here I got two objects. They're different from each other. But the only way I'm able to recognize that there's some sort of distinction here is to be able to unify them. I have to hold the thought of both of them together in my mind at the same time and find some way of relating them against each other, in this case shape, in order to recognize that there's a difference. Kant's point is that drawing a distinction actually serves to unify experiences, not to separate them, but to unify them cognitively and logically. That a recognition of difference is actually a way that I'm making connections in experience. That's a way I'm having a deeper understanding of what's going on with these things. So whether I recognize that there's some ways in which these things are the same, or some ways in which they're different, the same thing that's happening in both of those cases is I'm unifying experiences. I've got a paradigm that is allowing me to connect these experiences with each other, to recognize patterns and stuff, like we were talking about this morning in the Hume lecture. If I wasn't able to connect experiences with each other, then it would be like I'd be going from like moment to moment, like experience, 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 experience. I'd have no memory at all. Memory definitely requires me to have the ability to unify experience in my mind cognitively. This is a core ability of what we are as human beings and how we make sense of our experiences. And paradigms, worlds for Goodman, that word, those are the vehicles that allow us to do these things. And to go back to my original point from, I don't know, what was that, 10 minutes ago when I started talking about that? Reduction helps us. It helps us make a more efficient cognitive system. And remember again that the value of reduction is not to be had at the expense of a loss of fidelity. Oh, my battery is running low. Let me go grab my power cord. Sorry, guys. All right, sorry for that little interlude. So as I was saying, the efficiency and power we get from a reductive account can't happen at the expense of, I use the word fidelity. And I think that that's the perfect word for it. Because if there's, let's say this is happening. The big one that I'll share with you guys, the big reduction that really Goodman is very preoccupied with, because he sees it as the most common thing that Western philosophers are up to. When we're trying to find some way to reduce all of reality to one picture of reality, the most common one that we see is materialism. The idea that everything that exists in reality is just a physical process. That the only stuff that exists in reality is physical substance, and that's it. Physical laws, I mean, you get all that stuff too. But basically, materialism, physicalism, whatever name you want to put to it, there's been kind of a transition. Instead of saying materialism, people like to say physicalism now, to include not just matter, but like forces, laws of nature, and stuff like that. Whatever way you want to call it, this has been a very popular approach for understanding the fundamental picture of reality that everything else is supposed to be able to be reduced to. So you got things like artistic worldviews. Those can be reduced to materialism. Qualia, boom, it can be reduced to materialism. Psychological phenomenon, like thoughts and feelings of any kind, guess what? We can reduce those to physical brain states. You probably heard that kind of like logic before, that all a feeling really is a state of your brain. That is reductive materialism or reductive physicalism speaking, that view. And Goodman doesn't like this because he thinks when materialism is trying to reduce everything to materialism, to this framework of reference, this like set of concepts and principles and rules for how to relate experience together, we're losing something in the translation process here. Something is lost, especially things like qualia. You can't reduce the taste of peppermint ice cream to just a brain state. It's just not, it doesn't have that, what it is like to have that experience is not captured by knowing that there's a certain set of neurons that are firing when I have that feeling experience. There is some loss of information here that's going on, according to Goodman. So any reduction that has that loss in fidelity is a problem and not worth it. So Goodman's kind of final stance here on reduction and whether there are many worlds, whether we should endorse a bunch of different, like a pluralistic set of worlds, or whether we should adopt just one world. His kind of final stance on this is that all things considered, it would be better to have just one world, but only if we can get away with it. Only if we can really find, some up till now mysterious paradigm that allows us to relate all of these types of ways of looking at the world to one another in one consummate conceptual system that doesn't involve any loss of information or usefulness. And until we can do that, we can't have the reduction. We can't endorse the reduction until we actually have the ground to manage it. The same way that, like, when you're worried about things like fundamentalism, you're worried about people like having a very narrow way of understanding reality. And that when they try to understand everything through that kind of fundamentalist paradigm, and we're not just talking about religious fundamentalists here, by the way, fundamentalism is a psychological phenomenon that extends beyond just religious beliefs. But any kind of fundamentalist paradigm is missing out on some parts of reality. Sure, they can run the paradigm in every single case that they'll ever encounter, but there's something that's getting lost here. There's other aspects of reality that have not been captured by that reductive paradigm. So the reduction is not justified, according to Goodman. So Goodman thinks kind of the way things are right now with human thought, like all the theories, all the philosophies that are floating around, we don't yet have what this is. So until we figure this out, and he's not trying to stop us from trying. He's like, go on, like, take a shot, go for it. Until we actually have a paradigm that is strong enough and comprehensive enough and powerful enough to do this reduction, we're stuck having all of our different paradigms here, and we just have to keep them all. We have to tolerate a pluralism here, that's okay, Okay, and the reason why it is fair to say that we have to tolerate the pluralism is because the pluralism creates problems. Not all these things are relatable to each other. There might be some conflicts between these paradigms, that they're not just going to relate one to one. That's what we want the reductive paradigm to help us mediate all those differences. And until then, it's kind of like I've got a conflicting psyche. It's like I've got multiple personality disorder, or I've got these different modes. Like, here's one of my other favorite metaphors here for what Goodman is talking about. Do you ever have the experience like there's all these voices in your head that are telling you what to think and what to do, and they don't always get along? You have that kind of feeling? Eh? Yeah? People in the chat? I mean, I kind of think, yeah, humans have this experience all the time. Don't leave me hanging. Oh, I miss having my class right in front of me. But yeah, I mean, this is something I have. You got all these little voices, right? These little voices are like all these different paradigms, and they aren't consistent. And you look for ways to kind of get them in the same ballpark where they can be compared against each other, and we can like respect the differences and unify what's going on. But until we have a basis from which to do that, I kind of have to say, you know what? I can't get all you guys to talk to each other, so I'm just going to have to tolerate the cacophony that's in my head. And that's got to be okay, because each one of you is sharing something that's important. Now, one thing has to be said here about Goodman's pluralism. He's not saying every world is good, or every world has something important to say, or like every voice in your head is a useful one that has some value to it. Goodman isn't making any of those kinds of claims. He's not making any speculations on that so far. And in fact, I'd say Goodman's pluralism is way more rigorous than most people's monoism, like a singular reductive worldview. Um, it's pretty. It's not like by being a pluralist we just open the floodgates and let everyone come to the party. Now with subjectivism, there's a much more explicit demand that a paradigm justify its existence in what I'm going to endorse as reality, as like what's going on in my way of thinking about reality. If that paradigm is not meeting certain standards or doing important work, it's going to go away. It's got to make room for a better paradigm that can do those sorts of things. And these paradigms are always getting updated and that kind of thing. Um, so it is a process. Nothing is set in stone here. Um, and and yeah, I wanted to say this at some point too. I feel like when I've talked Goodman in the past and just talked with students about it, and what their experience with Goodman is like, sometimes the whole talk of paradigms is really scary. Like like that the word ideology can be scary. That I think sometimes we might have this model in our heads where we think that if we endorse a certain belief or a way of looking at the world, that just by endorsing it as true, I now no longer can consider other alternatives. Like I can't remain open-minded if I start subscribing to certain beliefs or perspectives. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think Goodman would think that that's true. This kind of goes back to the discussion I had way back at the beginning of the quarter about the fallibility principle of like, what does it take in order to recognize or acknowledge that you could be wrong, yet that the beliefs that you come to the table with might be incorrect, or they might not be justified. They might not be the most justified position on the debate. Same sort of thing is going on here. That for Goodman, world making is a process that's constantly sort of evolving. That I'm always taking the worlds I've got right now and I'm working on them. I'm trying to find ways to relate them together. I'm looking for ways to reduce them. I'm trying to make more powerful paradigms rather than having this big schizophrenic mess inside of my head. Okay? I'm trying to make all the connections together. Um, and the next phase of our discussion of Goodman, we'll talk about how we can do that. I just realized we're at 60 minutes already. It is flown by. I hope I haven't repeated myself too much, or I don't know. Have you guys felt like tonight was a little slower going, that we didn't accomplish as much? How are you guys feeling in the chat? Maybe you can tell me that after I get done recording. There. Some of this stuff might be like covering different ground too, but there is a different thing that's going on here than a lot of the classical ways of looking at philosophy and some of the other readings that we've had, especially from realism. Like with Goodman, we're firmly in the world of subjectivity, of human subjectivity. And one of the interesting things, the most interesting things to me about Goodman is how he gives us a kind of roadmap to subjectivity, that there's some patterns here. It's not just a free for all. It's not just like total chaos once we're in the world of subjectivity. That all of the subjective paradigms that we create in certain very specific ways, that we only have so many ways of constructing these things, and that there are standards that we're always holding ourselves accountable to, even if we're not always acknowledging that we are. There are rules that are governing how we're adopting the different worlds that we make. In particular, this is here's a little preview. I like giving this, like, next time on the video lecture in Philosophy 101, what are you going to get? Well, you're going to get a list of the different tools that we use for constructing worldviews. Some of them, there's kind of like a mix, half and half. Half of them are going to be what I'm going to call hardwired things. They're things that are not really optional. It's not like we can think around them. They're just like the basic conditions of subjectivity for human beings. Think about like hardwired cognitive elements. Like, here's a good example. You maybe have seen this illusion before. You know, which line is longer? Seems like it's going to be this one. We see this one as longer, even though they are the same length. Actually, no, that's a lie. I kind of drew one of them longer than the other. But this is a like classic visual illusion sort of thing. Optical illusion. That's the word I was looking for. Those are hardwired into how our brain processes the signals from our sensations, or to other aspects of how the mind works. But other things I'm going to talk about as software. There are things that we can manipulate through reasoning, that I can think about my own thoughts and start doing things with them subjectively. So I can do the hardwiring and the softwiring. Those are going to affect how I construct worlds and how I build them out of other worlds. So that's a big thing that we're going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about the standards, which is my favorite part. That's one of my favorite points about subjectivism, is that even if we're going to start talking about truth as something that is within the realm of human subjectivity, it's not like there are no rules. There are still rules, and there are maybe objective universal ones. So that's what we'll be doing next time. Can you guys in the chat, do you guys have any questions you want to throw at me that I'm going to tack in here on the end of the lecture before we call the video a quit? All right, sweet. Well, for all of you guys watching it there on YouTube, think about what questions you have and bring them to class on Monday, and we'll talk more about Goodman on Monday. So I'll see you then. Good night. I almost forgot the lecture, everybody, or the code, the lecture code. So here's our code tonight. Let's just have it be Einstein, since we were talking about frames of reference and relativity. So Einstein is the code. Put that in the quiz. That's the right answer. Good night.